You're listening to Puma Podcast.
I can say that for the Philippines specifically, there has been no significant improvement in addressing long-standing issues of corruption. And as you know, there has been recorded human rights abuses in the country, and that affects the perception of people, perceived level of corruption in the public sector, how they're managing.
I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka News. The latest edition of the Corruption Perception Index shows that the Philippines continues to lag behind the rest of the world.
Philippines has scored 33 out of 100 and ranking at 115th place out of a possible 180 countries.
In this episode, a representative from Transparency International walks us through the findings of the latest edition of their rigorous corruption ranking.
The countries with usually independent judiciaries tend to control corruption better. So for the country, I think, the perception of experts might be impacted by how entrenched the corruption is across the board, across major sectors in the country. My name is Urna Ulziikhuu. I work at Transparency International's Secretariat Office in Berlin as the regional coordinator for Asia. So I cover a lot of the countries in Asia and broader Pacific region. Corruption's Perceptions Index, in short, the CPI, scores and ranks countries based on the level of corruption in the public sector and how it's perceived by experts and business executives. It's actually a composite index, a combination of 13 surveys and assessments of corruption. The index has a scale from 0 to 100. 0 meaning the country is relatively high on corruption and widespread. And when countries get closer to 100 scores, not many do, it means that those countries are managing well in terms of effectively addressing corruption. So this year, CPI really reveals yet another year that there is no meaningful progress towards curbing corruption across the globe. And for Asia Pacific region specifically, for the 5th year in a row, the average CPI score has remained at 45 out of the possible 100 scores. So you can see that in many countries in the region, really corruption is thriving, and this score indicates that the countries are failing to stop corruption. If I draw on some statistics, for example, 68% of the countries across Asia Pacific, they do have score below 50. So you can see that majority of the countries in our region are not performing well.
Historically, the Philippines has been one of those countries that garner a score below 50. Could you tell us what the results were for the Philippines covering 2023?
Philippines has scored 33 out of 100 and ranking at 115th place out of a possible 180 countries. So this is a score that one score improvement and one place up from last year.
We share the same score and ranking with Ecuador, Indonesia, Malawi, Sri Lanka, and Turkey.
But if you really want to understand how well the state and public sector is doing in terms of effectively managing corruption, you should be looking at 5-year or 10-year trend. And when we look at specifically the Philippines, we don't see much change. It has really stagnated. Look back to 2019 or 2012, it had the same score of 34. So you can say that there has not been any significant changes in terms of the score or in terms of the place for the Philippines.
Again, a score of 50 or below means that a country has serious corruption problems. We've languished well below that score for several years now. A separate report released by Transparency International on the Philippines classified us as highly corrupt. Would you have any insight that you can share with us as to why the Philippines has been stagnant for the last several years?
We know that corruption affects almost all major sectors in the Philippines, and specifically judiciary and law enforcement. This year's CPI 2023 made linkages between corruption and injustice. So it's to do with access to justice as well.
A survey conducted by the corruption watchdog saw 19% of respondents admit that they paid bribes just to access public services within the last year. That's about 1 in 5 people. 86% of respondents identified corruption as a major problem in the country.
So if you look at the Philippines case, the countries with usually independent judiciaries tend to control corruption better. So for the country, I think, the perception of experts might be impacted by how entrenched the corruption is across the board, across major sectors in the country. Perhaps a potential lack of independence and resources and coordination between different agencies that might be hindering the ability of anti-corruption agenda or even anti-corruption institutions to perform effectively.
We'll pause here. We take a look at the bigger regional picture when we return. You mentioned like an average of 45 for the region. Just so that we can compare, how does that compare to other regions?
So Asia-Pacific region is very diverse. There are many countries who are top performers, such as the New Zealand, Singapore. We can mention a couple of them. But also there are countries that are struggling to curb corruption and having no effective control over it. You can see that the lowest performing countries include states like North Korea, Myanmar, and Afghanistan, etc. So it's really a mix, and this affects the average score level. And if you compare Asia-Pacific region to other regions, we are relatively doing okay compared to Latin America, for example, where the region score is averaging around 33, and Sub-Saharan Africa as well, around 33 to 35. The global average of CPI is actually at 43. You can say that maybe there is a hope for our region, but as I was saying, it's really a mix, and a lot of the top performing countries happen to be in our region.
I've noticed throughout the course of our conversation that human rights, what people would, recognize as issues that belong under the big umbrella of human rights, seem to form a big part of this index. And I was wondering, for our listeners who might view corruption and human rights as two separate issues, if you would be able to explain how those two things are connected.
I think human rights and corruption, they are interlinked, and human rights are the basis for any transparent and accountable government. And governments and public sector is there to serve the people they are elected from. And if you deny human rights, it means that you are denying their access to justice, judiciary, and access to public services they are entitled to. So corruption really plays in that, in denying the human rights to access some of the public services. This year, as I was saying, we are paying special attention to the linkages between corruption and injustice. So injustice means that people are being stolen of their rights in one way and another, and not being able to access independent judiciary system, for example, when they need.
In its report, Transparency International emphasized that the only way to keep corruption in check is to make sure that punishments for the crime are actually enforced.
I think what we should keep in mind is that independent and transparent judiciaries and law enforcement institutions, they are central to keeping corruption in check. We should be preventing the abuse of political power in the public sector, and bribery and other forms of corruption get in the way of us having access to ordinary people having access to their rights, right to freedom, right to freedom of speech, and public services. So you can see that how it can all impact and really affect daily lives of ordinary people.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. Pidoy Blanco edited this episode. Our executive producer is Jill Caro, and our senior news editor is Veronica Uwe. If you found this episode useful, share it with a friend or two. Thanks for listening.